The day had started like any other for John Carter. He awoke early, the alarm clock beeping insistently at 5:30 a.m., pulling him from a deep sleep. Another business trip. Another round of meetings in a city that felt a little more foreign each time he visited. It wasn't that he disliked his job, in fact, he loved the rush of negotiations, the smooth handshakes, the glistening skyscrapers. But lately, something had been off. He was starting to feel like a cog in a well-oiled machine, a machine that didn't need him. He felt like a man stuck in a loop, waking up, traveling, negotiating, and returning, only to do it all over again. No time for family, no time for reflection, no time for anything other than what was expected. He was good at what he did, but he couldn't shake the feeling that life was passing him by. That morning, he had packed his suitcase with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Slacks, shirts, tie, neatly arranged in the case. He was meticulous, not just with packing but with his entire life. Everything had its place. But today, there was something different. Maybe it was the exhaustion from too many red-eye flights, or the endless, bland hotel rooms he had grown accustomed to. Maybe it was just the weight of another trip ahead, but as he boarded the plane, a sense of frustration lingered in his chest. John walked toward his assigned seat in coach, glancing up at the first-class cabin as he passed. The leather seats looked so inviting, so comfortable, everything about that section seemed to scream luxury. But for John, luxury was something that always felt just out of reach. Sure, he could afford it, but he never allowed himself that indulgence. He had learned long ago that work was what mattered, not comfort. He was the kind of guy who kept his head down, did the work, and never questioned the routine. But something about that day felt different. He found himself daydreaming about the comfort he never allowed himself, thinking about the last time he had taken a real vacation or enjoyed something just for himself. As he approached his seat, John noticed a woman standing near his row, her face tense. She was dressed in a police uniform, with a badge visible on her chest. She was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense air about her, but there was something in her eyes, something that suggested she was going through something difficult. She looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place her. She was speaking with a flight attendant, and from the way they were talking, it was clear she wasn't happy. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked politely, her voice a little too rehearsed, the smile she wore slightly forced. "I was assigned this seat," the officer said, pointing to a spot in the middle of coach, her tone calm but firm. "I'm supposed to be sitting here. I was told this seat would be open." The flight attendant glanced at the seat and then back at the officer, hesitation creeping into her expression. "I'm afraid we've overbooked the flight, ma'am. We had to reassign some seats. This one is taken." John felt a slight irritation building up. It wasn't that he cared about the seat, it was the inconvenience of it all. He had been traveling for hours, and now here was this woman, who clearly hadn't planned her travel correctly, holding up the line. He just wanted to get settled, close his eyes, and forget about the endless meetings ahead. He had no patience for delays. His eyes darted to the overhead bins, already packed to the brim with passengers' luggage, and the long line of people still trying to find their seats. The officer's voice rose slightly, but not in anger, more in confusion. "But I've been assigned this seat. Is there another available?" she asked, trying to maintain her calm. "I'm afraid this is the only remaining seat," the flight attendant replied. "Would you mind moving to another section? We have an empty seat in business class." John had been standing there, waiting for the exchange to end, but he found himself glancing back at the officer. She stood still, her eyes scanning the area, and it was clear she wasn't going to let this go. He could see the tension in her posture, the way she straightened her back and narrowed her eyes, but it wasn't a look of hostility, it was determination. "Excuse me, miss," John interrupted, unable to stop himself. He had been trying to ignore the conversation, but something about her refusal to back down struck him. "But if she's assigned this seat, shouldn't she just be allowed to sit here? The officer turned her gaze on him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was a flicker of surprise, then recognition. She'd heard him, but it was clear she wasn't interested in making a scene. Still, her response was steady, even if it was a little clipped. "I've already asked to be moved, sir. I was told this was the seat. Now I'm trying to work with the staff to resolve it." John had the feeling that this wasn't just about a seat. There was something deeper in her words, something John couldn't put his finger on. Still, he couldn't let go of his own frustration. It wasn't personal, but this woman was making him late. That was all he cared about. He shifted uncomfortably, aware that the people behind him were getting impatient, too. Everyone on the plane seemed to be watching them now. The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension, looked at the officer once more and said, "Ma'am, if you can't move to another section, we'll have to ask you to deboard and wait for the next available flight." That statement seemed to make the air crackle with intensity. John could feel his irritation growing. He just wanted things to go smoothly. But Sarah, he had learned her name from the flight manifest, was standing her ground. She wasn't going to back down, not in front of all these people. It was as if something had snapped in her mind. Maybe she had dealt with this kind of nonsense for too long. Maybe she just wanted peace, just wanted to get home. But John couldn't understand why she was making it so difficult. He let out a sigh, rolling his eyes as he stepped aside to let the confrontation unfold. "Ma'am, please step aside," the flight attendant said, her voice strained. "If we can't resolve this, we'll need to ask you to leave." At this point, Sarah's jaw clenched. She took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. John watched as the muscle in her neck tensed, her posture stiffened, and for a moment, she seemed to be considering walking away. But she didn't. Instead, she slipped something from her pocket, folded it into a small, discreet note, and passed it to the flight attendant, who looked at it in surprise before handing it to John. The flight attendant quickly turned away to attend to other passengers, leaving John with a piece of paper he didn't ask for. He unfolded it with a mix of curiosity and impatience, wondering what it was about this woman that made her so different from anyone else he had ever met. The note was simple, but it struck John immediately. "I understand your frustration, but before you judge, take a moment to read this." For the first time in a long while, John felt something other than annoyance. The note wasn't a complaint, it wasn't even a plea for sympathy. It was a quiet request to be understood. Something about it caught his attention. John stood frozen, the note still in his hands. It was a strange moment. The tension in the cabin seemed to dissipate just a little, but the feeling of discomfort lingered in the air. As the flight attendant moved away to tend to other passengers, John looked down at the paper. The words weren't elaborate or forceful. They didn't try to sway him. It was just a short note, but it was enough to shift the course of his thoughts. He felt a sudden urge to know more about the officer standing near him, this woman who had sparked something in him that he hadn't even realized was there. His frustration, which had been building since the moment he'd boarded the plane, suddenly felt trivial in comparison. John glanced up, catching the officer's eyes again. This time, it was different. Instead of the cold, authoritative gaze he had expected, he saw a vulnerability in her eyes, something raw and human. She wasn't just standing there, she was waiting. Waiting for him to understand, waiting for something. John didn't know what, but his curiosity grew. He slipped the note into his jacket pocket, feeling as if he were making a decision that would alter the course of this encounter. The plane began to fill with the hum of voices, the clatter of suitcases being stowed away, and the settling of restless passengers into their seats. John made his way to his own seat, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. As he sat down, his eyes darted back to the officer. She had shifted slightly, her arms folded across her chest, but she wasn't looking at him now. She was looking out the window, her face turned toward the small sliver of sky visible through the narrow gap. There was something in her posture, something that spoke of weariness, of fatigue, and perhaps of disappointment. John felt the inexplicable need to approach her. He had always been the kind of person who valued order, routine, and stability. He was a man who followed the rules and expected others to do the same. This encounter, however, had forced him to question that mindset. What was it about this woman, this police officer, that had shaken him to the core? Was it the way she stood up for herself in the face of authority? Was it the quiet strength she displayed? Or was it the simple, honest message in the note that had made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about this world? Unable to resist, John stood up again and made his way down the aisle toward the officer. His heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to convince himself that this wasn't some rash decision, some impulsive need to satisfy his curiosity. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that had been building inside him ever since he first laid eyes on her. She was more than just a uniform. She was more than just a person on the plane who had caused him frustration. There was a story there, one he felt compelled to understand. When he reached her, she didn't look up immediately. Instead, she continued to stare out the window. John hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. Should he just ask her about the note? Should he apologize for his earlier thoughts? His mind raced through possibilities, but when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than he intended. "Excuse me," he said, his tone respectful but uncertain. The officer turned toward him slowly, her gaze meeting his once again. This time, there was no harshness in her eyes, no defensiveness. Instead, there was a weariness that made him feel as though he had just uncovered a small piece of her story. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. John swallowed, unsure of what to say next. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he was more interested in the person sitting across from him than in what others thought. I wanted to ask you about the note," he said, still standing. "It's just. I don't know. It felt like you were trying to tell me something. Something I need to understand." For a brief moment, the officer's expression faltered. It wasn't much, a slight lowering of her eyes, a barely perceptible shift in her posture, but John caught it. And in that moment, he knew he had just opened the door to something much deeper than he could have imagined. She took a deep breath and then, surprisingly, nodded. "I wasn't sure if you'd even read it. I didn't think anyone would care enough to." John's heart tightened at the hint of vulnerability in her words. "I read it," he replied, "and now I need to know more. I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I guess I was just caught up in my own frustration." The officer smiled faintly, the corner of her lips curling up ever so slightly. "It's fine. I've been dealing with much worse today." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she considered him. "You want to know what that note was about, don't you?" John nodded. "Yeah. But if it's something personal, you don't have to share it. Something about this whole situation feels off, you know?" For a long moment, the officer didn't speak. She simply looked at him, as if deciding whether or not to trust him. Then, with a heavy sigh, she leaned back in her seat and began to speak, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I'm Officer Sarah Lane," she said, her words slow but deliberate. "And yes, this is a bit personal. But I'll try to make it as brief as I can. This morning, I was assigned to escort a prisoner. I'm sure you've seen the news about the trial going on, the one where they're prosecuting the politician for corruption. Well, that's where I've been. I had to keep an eye on a man who's facing life in prison, and after the court session, I was assigned to be on this flight to make sure he wasn't going anywhere. It's routine, really. We're just supposed to keep watch." John blinked, taken aback by her words. This was not the story he had expected. The officer wasn't just an ordinary person, she was involved in something much larger, something that could have put her own life at risk. "Wait," John said, his voice tentative. "You were, with a prisoner? On this flight?" She nodded, her eyes cold and distant now. "Yeah. But the thing is, something happened on the flight." The man was acting strange. He started looking around like he recognized people, then he got really quiet. "I don't know why, but I felt like something was off. That's when I asked to be moved to a different seat, just to keep a better eye on him. But, well, things didn't go as planned." John felt his stomach churn. John swallowed, unsure of what to say next. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he was more interested in the person sitting across from him than in what others thought. I wanted to ask you about the note," he said, still standing. "It's just. I don't know. It felt like you were trying to tell me something. Something I need to understand." For a brief moment, the officer's expression faltered. It wasn't much, a slight lowering of her eyes, a barely perceptible shift in her posture, but John caught it. And in that moment, he knew he had just opened the door to something much deeper than he could have imagined. She took a deep breath and then, surprisingly, nodded. "I wasn't sure if you'd even read it. I didn't think anyone would care enough to." John's heart tightened at the hint of vulnerability in her words. "I read it," he replied, "and now I need to know more. I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I guess I was just caught up in my own frustration." The officer smiled faintly, the corner of her lips curling up ever so slightly. "It's fine. I've been dealing with much worse today." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she considered him. "You want to know what that note was about, don't you?" John nodded. "Yeah. But if it's something personal, you don't have to share it. Something about this whole situation feels off, you know?" For a long moment, the officer didn't speak. She simply looked at him, as if deciding whether or not to trust him. Then, with a heavy sigh, she leaned back in her seat and began to speak, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I'm Officer Sarah Lane," she said, her words slow but deliberate. "And yes, this is a bit personal. But I'll try to make it as brief as I can. This morning, I was assigned to escort a prisoner. I'm sure you've seen the news about the trial going on, the one where they're prosecuting the politician for corruption. Well, that's where I've been. I had to keep an eye on a man who's facing life in prison, and after the court session, I was assigned to be on this flight to make sure he wasn't going anywhere. It's routine, really. We're just supposed to keep watch." John blinked, taken aback by her words. This was not the story he had expected. The officer wasn't just an ordinary person, she was involved in something much larger, something that could have put her own life at risk. "Wait," John said, his voice tentative. "You were, with a prisoner? On this flight?" She nodded, her eyes cold and distant now. "Yeah. But the thing is, something happened on the flight." The man was acting strange. He started looking around like he recognized people, then he got really quiet. "I don't know why, but I felt like something was off. That's when I asked to be moved to a different seat, just to keep a better eye on him. But, well, things didn't go as planned." John felt his stomach churn. The tension between them made sense now. Sarah wasn't just trying to get a better seat, she was trying to protect herself and everyone else on the plane from a threat she couldn't quite identify. "So, you weren't just being difficult?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I wasn't. I just couldn't explain it at the time. But what I didn't know was that while I was sitting there, the man had slipped something under his seat. I only realized it when I checked after he'd been removed from the flight. He had a phone hidden there. I don't know who he was working with, but it's not over yet. There's more to this than anyone knows." John's mind raced. The implications were huge. He had been irritated about a seat assignment, and now here he was, sitting next to a police officer who had just uncovered something far more dangerous than any of them had realized. The urgency in her eyes told him that this wasn't just a story, it was a warning. He had no idea where this was going, but one thing was certain, nothing about this flight, or this day, was going to be what he thought. Before he could ask more, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing the flight's impending takeoff. John glanced at Sarah once more, his curiosity mixed with a sense of unease. There was so much more to this story than he could have ever imagined. "Looks like we're about to take off," he said, standing. "We'll talk more when we land." She nodded, but there was no reassurance in her eyes. Just the kind of resolve he could never have anticipated. He returned to his seat, the weight of the note still heavy in his pocket, but now he understood that the journey ahead would be far more than just another business trip. It would be one he would never forget. As the plane lifted off, the world outside the window seemed to shrink into an indistinct blur of clouds and horizon. John's mind, however, was anything but tranquil. His thoughts raced faster than the plane's ascent, each moment of the past hour flashing through his mind. The seemingly insignificant exchange with the officer had taken on an entirely new weight. He hadn't realized at first just how much was at stake in that one conversation. The information Sarah had shared with him, the mention of a hidden phone, the strange behavior of the prisoner, the sense of danger that she had felt, it all added up to something far more sinister than he had ever anticipated. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward the officer once more. She had settled into her seat now, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes closed. It was as if she were preparing herself for something, or perhaps trying to keep the weight of everything that had happened from overwhelming her. Her presence was different now, less rigid, more human. For the first time, John could see the toll this job had taken on her. The uniform, the stern face, the quiet confidence, those things had all hidden the truth. She was just like everyone else, carrying burdens, trying to make sense of a world that didn't always make sense. His thoughts returned to the note she had slipped him. It was just a few words, but they had ignited something in him, a curiosity that pushed him forward, even when logic told him to sit back and leave well enough alone. "You want to know what that note was about, don't you?" Sarah's words echoed in his mind, and he realized that, yes, he did want to know. He didn't just want to satisfy his curiosity, something told him that this was about more than just one officer's mission or one prisoner's escape plan. There was a deeper story here, one that intertwined with the community, with the people around them, and even with his own life in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the plane leveled out and the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing that they had reached cruising altitude, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to settle into a dull hum of activity. Passengers began to relax, some taking out books, others pulling down the tray tables to enjoy a drink or a snack. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, something far beyond the comfort of their temporary flight. He glanced at the seat pocket in front of him, and without thinking, pulled out a magazine. It was the first distraction that had come to him, but the words blurred in his vision. The news stories and advertisements all seemed so trivial, so far removed from the moment he had just shared with Sarah. He wasn't the only one who seemed uneasy. Looking around the cabin, John could see a few passengers who seemed to be on edge, their eyes darting nervously to the flight attendants and then to one another. There was an unspoken tension in the air, as if the flight wasn't as ordinary as it appeared on the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that the plane was more than just a vessel for getting people from point A to point B. It was a ticking clock, an unavoidable path towards something he hadn't yet fully grasped. John glanced at Sarah again. She was still staring out the window, lost in thought, her fingers lightly tapping on the armrest. There was a momentary hesitation before he stood up and walked toward her again. This time, however, he didn't feel the same nervousness. He was no longer trying to figure out what was going on, instead, he was beginning to realize that this was bigger than anything he could have anticipated. He had to understand it. He had to know why Sarah, this officer, was involved in something so much deeper than he'd originally thought. "Sarah," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his with a mix of wariness and fatigue. "John," she said, nodding. "What is it?" John pulled the note from his pocket and unfolded it, the small words written in hurried script still clear in his mind. He held it up for her to see. "This note," he began, "it's what got me thinking. You said you were trying to keep an eye on someone, but now, I'm starting to wonder what exactly that meant. What exactly are you involved in?" For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she took a deep breath, and for the first time since they had spoken, John saw her shoulders drop, as if the weight of everything she had been holding in was beginning to break through. The officer who had seemed so impenetrable earlier now appeared vulnerable, and that vulnerability drew John in. "I wish I could explain it all right now," Sarah finally said, her voice soft but edged with urgency. "But I can't." "Not yet." John nodded, but his frustration was palpable. "Then tell me what you can," he pressed. "I don't understand any of this. The prisoner, the phone, the note. There's something you're not telling me." Sarah hesitated again, then glanced around the cabin as if ensuring no one was paying too much attention to their conversation. "All right," she said, her voice low. "But you have to understand, what I'm about to tell you, it's not something I'm supposed to share. Not with anyone." John leaned forward slightly, his heart racing. "I'm not just anyone, Sarah. If you're in danger, I need to know. If there's a threat on this flight, I need to be prepared." She met his gaze, her eyes dark with concern. "It's not just me who's in danger," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The entire flight is. The man I'm guarding isn't just any criminal. He's been connected to a group of people who have ties to some pretty dangerous organizations. And I think that's why he's been so unsettled. He's not acting out of fear for himself, he's scared of what's coming for all of us." John's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't imagined anything of this magnitude. His mind raced as he processed her words. Dangerous organizations? Ties to criminal groups? None of it made sense. Why had he not been told anything about this by the airline? Why hadn't there been any warnings? And the phone? John asked, his voice barely audible. "What does it have to do with all of this?" Sarah's expression hardened, her gaze flickering toward the aisle before settling back on him. "The phone. It's not just a phone. It's a key to something much bigger than any of us realize. The man, the prisoner, is a part of something larger. He's been used to move people, to send messages, and that phone contains all the evidence. It has connections to international organizations, people who will stop at nothing to keep their operation running smoothly. That's why he's been acting so strange. I don't know if he's been brainwashed or if he's just scared, but he's dangerous." John sat back in his seat, trying to process everything. The situation had escalated from an uncomfortable flight into something far more serious. It wasn't just about an officer trying to get a better seat anymore. There was a real threat on board, and everything that he had thought he knew had just been turned on its head. As the plane continued to soar through the sky, John knew that things were about to get much more complicated. He didn't know who could be trusted. He didn't know who was in on this plot and who was just as unaware as he had been only hours ago. But one thing was for certain, he was caught up in something that he couldn't just walk away from now. The course of this flight, and the course of his life, had been altered by forces beyond his control. John looked at Sarah one more time, his mind racing. "What happens now?" he asked. Her eyes darkened, and for the first time since they had begun talking, there was a flicker of something dangerous in her gaze. "We stay alert," she said, her voice steady. "And we do everything we can to keep everyone safe. Because it's only a matter of time before they make their move." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. Whatever came next, this was no longer just a routine flight. It was the beginning of something far bigger, and the consequences of what happened in the hours to come would ripple out to affect far more than just the passengers on board. It would affect their community, their safety, and their very understanding of the world around them. As the days went by, John couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him had shifted. Everything seemed to have changed the moment Sarah had revealed the truth about the situation aboard the plane. What had seemed like an ordinary flight, a chance encounter with a friendly officer, had turned into something far more sinister. The authorities' efforts to keep the details of the incident under wraps only heightened his sense of unease. What was it about the prisoner? What was this hidden operation that stretched far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin? John had hoped to let it all go, to return to his regular life and pretend nothing had happened. But he couldn't. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about the danger she had warned him of, and about the lives that could be affected if the threat wasn't neutralized. The phone, the prisoner, the strange references to international organizations, none of it made sense to him, yet it all felt connected, as if the pieces of the puzzle were scattered just beyond his grasp, waiting for him to make sense of it. His phone buzzed late one evening as he was sitting at his kitchen table, his mind reeling with thoughts he couldn't fully process. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat as he saw Sarah's name flashing on the screen. It was strange. After the encounter on the plane, they had exchanged a few texts, but nothing like this. She hadn't called him directly. She hadn't even seemed particularly eager to stay in touch. What was going on now? Hello? John answered, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed a slight tension. John, Sarah's voice came through, low and urgent. We need to meet. Now. His stomach clenched. It wasn't like Sarah to sound so desperate. She had been composed, even when she'd revealed the scope of the situation. This was different. What's going on? He asked, his pulse quickening. There's been a development, she said. Something's wrong. You need to come to the location I'll send you. Trust me, it's not safe here anymore. John didn't need any further explanation. He grabbed his jacket, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the quiet streets of his neighborhood seemed strangely distant, like he was stepping out of his own world and into something far more dangerous. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but he knew that it was no longer a matter of curiosity. This was about survival, about protecting himself, and protecting others. The meeting place was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. John had never been there before, but the location felt wrong, like a place that didn't belong. When he arrived, the surrounding streets were eerily empty, and the building itself seemed like a relic from another time, decaying, forgotten, but still standing. The windows were dark, the walls crumbling. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he approached the entrance. It was as if the world around him was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He stepped inside, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. The place was cold, damp, and filled with the musty scent of neglect. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows for any sign of Sarah. It didn't take long for her to step out from behind one of the columns, her face tense, her eyes scanning the room behind her as though expecting someone, or something, else to appear. You came, she said, her voice tight. I didn't think you would. Of course I came, John replied, feeling a surge of determination. What's going on? What did you need to tell me? Sarah glanced over her shoulder one more time before pulling him into the relative safety of a darkened corner. I don't have much time, she said. I need you to understand that things are much worse than I thought. The prisoner, he wasn't just a decoy. There's a plan in motion, and we're all in the middle of it. John's head spun. What do you mean? He asked. You said he was part of a dangerous group, but you didn't explain what they're after. They're after more than just information, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed urgency. They're after power, control. This phone, the one that the prisoner was carrying, isn't just a communications device. It's a key to something far bigger. And they're willing to do anything to get it back. John's heart raced. He tried to process her words, but the weight of it all was too much to grasp in one sitting. A phone, something that could hold the power to change everything. It didn't make sense, and yet Sarah's conviction was undeniable. She believed it, and now he did too. So what do we do? John asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. How do we stop them? Sarah's gaze flickered with a hint of something, fear, uncertainty, but she quickly masked it. We don't stop them, she said quietly. At least, not alone. You need to go to the authorities. You need to take this information to someone who can help. This isn't something we can handle on our own. John hesitated. His instinct told him to trust Sarah, but part of him balked at the idea of involving anyone else. What if they couldn't be trusted? What if they were already compromised? Sarah had been a part of this operation, but how did she know who was truly on their side? Are you sure? He asked. We can't just handle this ourselves. Sarah's eyes darkened, and for a moment, John could see the toll the past few days had taken on her. She was no longer just the confident officer who had first boarded the plane, she was a person who had seen too much, who had borne too many secrets. John, she said softly, I've seen what these people can do. We don't stand a chance unless we have backup. Please. Trust me. He nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. He knew she was right, and he knew that what she was asking wasn't just about the phone or the prisoner, it was about something larger. Something far more dangerous than he could fully comprehend. The next few days were a blur. John contacted the authorities and relayed the information Sarah had given him, but even as he did so, doubt gnawed at him. Who could he trust? Were they already too deep into the conspiracy to stop it? But there was no turning back now. He had given them the information, and he could only hope that they would act before it was too late. The next morning, Sarah reached out to him again. The phone call was short but urgent. They know, she said. They know we're on to them. They've already made their move. John felt his blood run cold. It was happening. The conspiracy was unfolding, and they were in the middle of it. He had no idea how far this went, or who was pulling the strings, but he knew one thing for certain, there was no escaping it. They were all in danger now. As the weight of the situation settled on him, John realized that his life, the life he had known, had been irrevocably changed. There was no going back. The shadows were closing in, and whatever came next, he would have to face it head-on. The days following Sarah's phone call were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Every moment seemed filled with a sense of impending danger, and John could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him more and more. He had never imagined that his brief encounter with an officer on a plane would lead to this, a complex web of intrigue, conspiracy, and imminent threats. The phone call had rattled him to his core, but now, it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. He had done what Sarah had asked, he had contacted the authorities, relayed the information, and hoped for the best. But that hope was quickly diminishing as the days wore on, and the tension continued to mount. The phone call had come in the middle of a quiet evening when John had finally allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. He had settled into his living room, the soft hum of the TV playing in the background, when his phone buzzed sharply against the wooden table. He had no idea that the sound would be the precursor to the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would plunge him deeper into a world of secrets and danger he had never imagined. John, Sarah's voice came through the phone, more frantic this time. It's happening. They know who you are, and they're coming for you. His heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, coming for me? His voice was tight, filled with fear he couldn't suppress. His mind raced, trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle. Who knows? Everyone, she replied, her voice trembling. The ones we've been trying to stop. They know that you're involved. You're a liability now. They won't stop until they silence you. John stood, his knees buckling slightly beneath him as the gravity of her words hit him. He knew this moment had been coming, but hearing it from Sarah made it real. The danger was no longer distant, it was at his doorstep. He felt the cold weight of fear settle in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him as his mind raced for a solution. What could he do? Where could he go? He was no longer just a witness to a strange set of circumstances, he was now an active participant, a player in a deadly game with far higher stakes than he had ever anticipated. Where are you? We need to meet, he said, trying to maintain some semblance of calm, even as his pulse raced. I'm at a safe house, she answered quickly. It's the only place I can be for now. You need to get here, and fast. But you need to be careful. They're watching everything. The second you step out of your door, they'll know. John's thoughts were a whirlwind. He couldn't afford to wait around any longer. He needed to act. But Sarah's warning had left him with a deep unease. How could they possibly escape this? The people they were up against were relentless, and now that they knew he was involved, the clock was ticking. John left his apartment in a rush, every step heavy with the knowledge that his every move was being tracked. The streets outside seemed quieter than usual, almost too still. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone he passed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on him, that someone was watching from the shadows. The city felt different now, like a trap slowly closing in on him. It was a long drive to the safe house. Each passing moment felt like a beat in a countdown to something far worse. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind. They knew who he was. He was a target now, and there was no turning back. As he turned onto a narrow, dimly lit road, the streetlights flickering overhead, John's anxiety reached its peak. The phone call had come in the middle of a quiet evening when John had finally allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. He had settled into his living room, the soft hum of the TV playing in the background, when his phone buzzed sharply against the wooden table. He had no idea that the sound would be the precursor to the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would plunge him deeper into a world of secrets and danger he had never imagined. John, Sarah's voice came through the phone, more frantic this time. It's happening. They know who you are, and they're coming for you. His heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, coming for me? His voice was tight, filled with fear he couldn't suppress. His mind raced, trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle. Who knows? Everyone, she replied, her voice trembling. The ones we've been trying to stop. They know that you're involved. You're a liability now. They won't stop until they silence you. John stood, his knees buckling slightly beneath him as the gravity of her words hit him. He knew this moment had been coming, but hearing it from Sarah made it real. The danger was no longer distant, it was at his doorstep. He felt the cold weight of fear settle in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him as his mind raced for a solution. What could he do? Where could he go? He was no longer just a witness to a strange set of circumstances, he was now an active participant, a player in a deadly game with far higher stakes than he had ever anticipated. Where are you? We need to meet, he said, trying to maintain some semblance of calm, even as his pulse raced. I'm at a safe house, she answered quickly. It's the only place I can be for now. You need to get here, and fast. But you need to be careful. They're watching everything. The second you step out of your door, they'll know. John's thoughts were a whirlwind. He couldn't afford to wait around any longer. He needed to act. But Sarah's warning had left him with a deep unease. How could they possibly escape this? The people they were up against were relentless, and now that they knew he was involved, the clock was ticking. John left his apartment in a rush, every step heavy with the knowledge that his every move was being tracked. The streets outside seemed quieter than usual, almost too still. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone he passed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on him, that someone was watching from the shadows. The city felt different now, like a trap slowly closing in on him. It was a long drive to the safe house. Each passing moment felt like a beat in a countdown to something far worse. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind. They knew who he was. He was a target now, and there was no turning back. As he turned onto a narrow, dimly lit road, the streetlights flickering overhead, John's anxiety reached its peak. "They've been watching us for weeks," Sarah continued, her voice growing more urgent. "They know everything about you. About me. About the phone. And if they get their hands on it, well, we can't let that happen." The enormity of the situation hit John like a wave, drowning him in a sea of uncertainty and fear. His life had changed overnight, and now, it felt like the world was closing in on him. He had no idea who he could trust, no idea who was on his side, and no idea how to stop what was coming. He had never signed up for this. He had never asked to be a part of this nightmare. Sarah's expression softened for a moment as she looked at him. "You didn't sign up for this. But now, we have no choice. We have to protect the phone, no matter the cost." John nodded slowly, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. He had no idea what the future held or what he was about to face, but he knew one thing: there was no turning back. This was his reality now, and he would have to survive it. But as Sarah turned to the window, her gaze distant and filled with something John couldn't quite place, he wondered if they were already too late. Was there any hope of stopping the shadowy figures who wanted to destroy everything? Or had they already lost the battle before it even began? The answer, he realized, wasn't something they could know yet. Not until they confronted the full scope of the operation, and faced whatever dangers lay ahead. As the days went by, the sense of dread grew heavier, settling over John like a dark cloud he couldn't escape. Each hour felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something far beyond his control. The urgency of their situation began to sink in deeper. They couldn't afford to wait for help, they had to take matters into their own hands. But every move they made felt like it led them closer to a trap. John sat quietly in the safe house, staring out the grimy window that overlooked the empty street. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before someone came for him. The phone, the one thing that had started all of this madness, was still safe in his pocket. But Sarah's warnings echoed in his mind like a constant drumbeat: they know about the phone. They will stop at nothing to get it. The shadows of the night grew longer, and the weight of what was at stake began to press down on him harder. The phone was more than just a device, it was a symbol, a key to something vast and dangerous. John wasn't just involved in some isolated conspiracy anymore. He was at the center of something global, something with the potential to shift the balance of power in ways he couldn't even comprehend. And Sarah? Sarah had been in this game far longer than he had. She knew the risks better than anyone. But as she paced restlessly across the room, John could see the toll it was taking on her. The calm composure she once wore like armor was starting to crack. "They're closing in," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. She stood by the door, looking out into the night, her face etched with concern. "I can feel it. They're closer than we think." John looked up at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. He was no longer a passive participant in this story. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "We move. We can't stay here much longer. They'll find this place soon enough. We need to get the phone out of sight." "And we need to get the hell out of the city," Sarah replied, her voice steady but tinged with an unmistakable urgency. John swallowed, the decision weighing on him. He had never imagined he'd be caught in something like this, running for his life, always looking over his shoulder, unsure of who to trust. But now, he had no choice. He had to protect not only himself but Sarah as well. If they were going to survive this, they needed to think on their feet, move fast, and never look back. The next few hours were a blur of frantic preparation. Sarah had already gathered what they needed: basic supplies, a change of clothes, and the all-important phone. John barely had time to think as he packed a bag with whatever essentials he could grab. The longer they stayed in the safe house, the more exposed they became. Every second spent there was another second wasted. The sense of impending danger was suffocating. They left the safe house under the cover of darkness, the night air cold against their skin. The streets were eerily quiet, the city seemingly holding its breath. John could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as they made their way through the alleys, trying to keep as far off the main roads as possible. Every sound felt amplified in the silence of the night: the distant hum of traffic, the creak of a door opening somewhere, the soft shuffle of their footsteps on the pavement. John tried not to look over his shoulder, but every few seconds, he couldn't help himself. The fear gnawed at him, a constant presence he couldn't shake. They reached a parking garage a few blocks away, a place Sarah had been using as a temporary hideout for the last few days. The underground levels were dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as they walked toward the farthest corner where an unmarked van was parked. It was a nondescript vehicle, easy to miss among the other cars, and it was exactly what they needed. There was no time to waste. Sarah slid into the driver's seat with practiced ease, her hands moving quickly as she started the engine. John climbed into the passenger seat, trying to calm his racing heart. They had to get out of the city, and fast. As they drove through the darkened streets, John's mind whirled with questions. What happens next? How do we stop them? But even more pressing was the question of who they were. The men and women hunting them were no ordinary criminals. They were part of something far more dangerous, a network that spanned the globe. John had learned over the past few days just how deep this went, and the realization left him feeling small and powerless. He had been thrust into a game with no rules and no way to win. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to get to a safe location outside the city. I have a contact who can help us. But we'll need to move quickly. They'll be tracking us, John. We can't afford to make any mistakes." John nodded, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. He didn't need to be told twice. He knew how close they were to disaster. The world outside the van seemed to blur as Sarah sped through the streets, the cityscape gradually giving way to the open road. For a brief moment, John allowed himself to relax, to feel the sense of freedom that came with putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. But the peace was short-lived. They had barely made it out of the city when Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it quickly, her face growing pale. "They found us," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with a mix of fear and frustration. "It's too late." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do we do now?" Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We don't stop. We don't slow down. We keep going, no matter what." The tension in the van reached a fever pitch as they sped down the highway, the headlights of a pursuing vehicle now visible in the rearview mirror. John's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of this, anything that would get them to safety. But there was no escape. They had become part of a larger story, a dangerous game where the rules were made by forces beyond their control. The road ahead seemed endless, but so did the threat behind them. It wasn't long before Sarah took a sharp turn onto a smaller, less traveled road. The van bounced slightly as they veered off the main highway, and John's stomach churned with a mix of adrenaline and fear. Sarah's eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, her expression grim. "They're closing in," she said, her voice low but firm. "We need to lose them. Now." John's breath caught in his throat as Sarah slammed her foot on the accelerator, pushing the van to its limits. The tires screeched as they sped down the narrow road, the sound of the pursuing vehicle growing louder in their ears. John could feel the tension in the air, every second felt like an eternity. He had no idea what Sarah had in mind, but he knew they had to act fast. A few miles down the road, Sarah took another sharp turn, this time onto a dirt path that cut through a dense wooded area. The van jolted as they hit the rough terrain, and John gripped the armrest with white knuckles. The vehicle bounced erratically, but Sarah held the wheel steady, her eyes focused ahead. The pursuing vehicle was still close behind, its headlights flashing in the distance, but they were gaining ground on the road less traveled. John couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope as they drove deeper into the woods. They might just make it. But the sound of the pursuing vehicle's engine grew louder, and the reality of the situation set in again. The people after them weren't going to give up. They weren't going to let this go. No matter how fast they drove or how far they went, it wasn't over. Not yet. The dirt road twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest. They had been driving for what felt like hours, and John was starting to wonder if they would ever get out of this alive. The vehicle behind them was relentless, and Sarah's eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. It was clear they weren't going to shake them. Suddenly, Sarah jerked the wheel to the left, throwing the van onto a smaller trail. John gasped as the vehicle skidded dangerously on the loose gravel, barely staying on course. The forest around them grew darker, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the pressure in the van was palpable. They were running out of time.